Whispers followed Josephine everywhere in Bitter Creek. Gossips called her ruined, stained by a past that respectable folks only spoke of behind closed doors. Men looked at her as a prize to be broken, while women crossed the dirt street to avoid her shadow. Everyone expected her to crawl away and perish in the dust. Then, a towering shadow descended from the high timberline. Silas Boone walked into a town built on hypocrisy, took one look at the woman they threw to the wolves, and made his stance clear. He didn't care about untouched innocence. He wanted the survivor. Bitter Creek, Wyoming Territory, in the year 1882, was not a place that offered second chances. It was a harsh, wind-battered mining town, clinging to the edge of the frontier, populated by desperate men and women who clung to rigid societal rules as a shield against the wilderness. If a woman fell from grace in Bitter Creek, she did not simply hit the ground. She was trampled into the mud by every passing boot. Josephine Mercer knew the taste of that mud all too well. At 24, she possessed a stark, haunting beauty, high cheekbones, dark hair that refused to be tamed into neat Victorian buns, and piercing gray eyes that had seen far too much cruelty for one lifetime. She had arrived in town 3 years prior as the reluctant bride of Jeremiah Mercer, a silver-tongued charlatan who promised her the world and delivered only debt, disgrace, and a daily regimen of terror. When Jeremiah was finally shot dead over a marked deck of cards in a filthy saloon down in Cheyenne, the town of Bitter Creek did not offer Josephine their condolences. They offered her the bill for his sins. Jeremiah had borrowed heavily against everything they owned, mostly from Beauregard Hayes, the town's wealthiest land baron and bank manager. Beauregard was a man who hid a venomous soul behind a tailored suit and a polished pocket watch. When the debts came due, he foreclosed on Josephine's small house, confiscated her few belongings, and made a public spectacle of her ruin. He offered her a way out, of course, a quiet, shameful arrangement where she would serve as his private mistress in exchange for a roof over her head. Josephine had spat at his polished boots. For that defiance, Beauregard made it his personal mission to see her broken. He ensured no respectable business would hire her. The women of the town, led by the pious and vicious Henrietta Higgins, barred her from the church and the sewing circles. Josephine was reduced to taking in the bloodiest, filthiest laundry from the transient miners, living in a dilapidated, drafty shack on the absolute edge of town, right where the civilized dirt roads gave way to the untamed, predator-filled woods. She worked until her hands cracked and bled, her knuckles raw from harsh lye soap and freezing water. Every time she walked into town to buy meager supplies, the men would leer, whispering crude propositions, assuming a widow in debt was a woman who could be bought for a handful of copper coins. She ignored them. She kept her chin high, her spine stiff, and her gray eyes cold. They wanted her to beg. They wanted her to break. She swore to the open, empty sky that she would die of starvation before she gave Beauregard Hayes the satisfaction of a tear. It was on a particularly bitter Tuesday in late October, when the sky was the color of bruised iron and a freezing rain turned the streets to a thick, sucking mire, that the mountain man came to town. His name was Silas Boone, though most folks simply referred to him as the Bear of Blackridge. He only descended from his high-altitude claim twice a year to trade pelts and gold dust for supplies. He was a terrifying figure to the civilized townsfolk, a massive wall of muscle and bone standing well over 6.5 feet tall, clad in heavy buckskin and a thick coat made of wolf fur. A jagged, faded scar cut through his thick, dark beard, running from his cheekbone down to his jawline, a brutal souvenir from a grizzly that had lost an argument with his hunting knife. Silas did not speak unless it was necessary. He carried a heavy Winchester rifle with an easy familiarity, and he moved with a silent, predatory grace that made the town's stray dogs whimper and hide under the boardwalks. On this particular day, Silas was loading 100-pound sacks of flour and salt into his sturdy pack mules outside Higgins Mercantile. The cold rain was driving down in sheets, washing the manure and dirt down the slanted street. Josephine was making her way toward the Mercantile, her threadbare shawl pulled tight around her shivering shoulders. She was carrying a heavy basket of wet, washed laundry, struggling to keep her footing in the slick, treacherous mud. She had spent the last of her coins on a single loaf of stale bread and desperately needed to deliver this laundry to a miner's boarding house just to afford firewood for the night. Beauregard Hayes stepped out of the saloon across the street, flanked by two of his hired enforcers, a sneer twisting his handsome features. He had been drinking, and the sight of Josephine struggling in the rain ignited his cruel, controlling nature. He stepped off the boardwalk, his expensive leather boots sinking into the mud, intentionally blocking her path. "Miss Mercer," Beauregard drawled loudly, ensuring the men loitering under the awnings could hear. "Looking a bit drowned today, aren't we? It breaks my heart to see a woman of your delicate constitution working like a pack mule in the muck." Josephine stopped, her arms trembling under the weight of the wet laundry. She didn't look up, focusing on his boots. "Step aside, Mr. Hayes. I have work to deliver." "Work," Beauregard chuckled, stepping closer, his whiskey-laced breath hot against the frigid air, washing the filth out of other men's drawers. What a tragic waste of a pretty face. "You know, my offer still stands, Josie. A warm bed, hot meals. All you have to do is drop this foolish pride. Everyone knows what you are. A ruined widow, a soiled dove without a roost. Stop pretending you have any honor left to protect." Josephine's head snapped up, her gray eyes blazing with a feral, cornered fury. "I would rather freeze in the dirt than share your bed, Beauregard." The bank manager's face darkened with rage. The public rejection stung his massive ego. He lunged forward and slapped the heavy basket out of her hands. The wicker hit the ground, spilling freshly washed, pristine white shirts into the thick, brown slurry of the street. Josephine let out a ragged gasp, dropping to her knees in the mud, frantically trying to salvage the garments she had spent hours scrubbing. If they were ruined, she wouldn't get paid. If she didn't get paid, she wouldn't eat. Beauregard laughed, a cruel, sharp sound. He placed the heel of his boot squarely onto one of the white shirts, grinding it into the mud. "Look at you," he sneered, "crawling in the dirt where you belong. You're nothing, Josie. You're damaged goods. No decent man in this territory will ever touch you, and no respectable woman will ever look at you. You belong to the mud, or you belong to me." The men on the boardwalk snickered. Henrietta Higgins watched from the window of the Mercantile, a self-righteous smirk on her face. Josephine's hands shook as she clutched the ruined fabric. The cold was seeping into her bones, but the humiliation burned like a brand against her skin. She closed her eyes, willing herself not to cry, refusing to give them the victory. Then, the heavy thud of massive boots echoed through the driving rain. The snickering abruptly stopped. The street fell dead silent, save for the patter of the icy downpour. Silas Boone walked slowly into the center of the muddy street. The rain hissed against his heavy fur coat. He stopped just a few feet away from Beauregard, towering over the wealthy bank manager like an ancient redwood over a weed. His dark eyes, hard as obsidian, shifted from Beauregard to Josephine, who was still kneeling in the mud, and back to Beauregard. "Move your foot," Silas rumbled. His voice was incredibly deep, a low, gravelly vibration that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. Beauregard blinked, taking a sudden, involuntary half-step backward before his pride rooted him in place. His two enforcers tensed, their hands hovering near their holstered revolvers, but neither made a move to draw. They weren't suicidal. "This is none of your concern, Mountain Man," Beauregard said, trying to maintain his authoritative tone, though his voice wavered slightly. "This woman owes me a substantial debt. She is a woman of ill repute, paying the price for her stubbornness." "I said," Silas repeated, the timbre of his voice dropping even lower, carrying a lethal promise. "Move your foot." Beauregard swallowed hard. He looked at Silas's massive hands, at the wicked hunting knife strapped to his thigh, and at the cold, dead certainty in his eyes. Slowly, Beauregard lifted his boot off the ruined shirt and took a step back. Silas didn't look at the banker again. He crouched down, his massive frame descending gracefully despite his size. He ignored the mud, soaking into his buckskins. He reached out with a hand the size of a dinner plate, his thick fingers surprisingly gentle as they grasped Josephine's freezing, raw hands. "Leave the laundry," Silas said quietly, his eyes locking onto hers. Josephine stared up at him, her breath hitching. Up close, the scars on his face were even more pronounced, his features rough-hewn and weathered by extreme elements. Yet, in his dark eyes, she saw absolutely no pity. She saw no lust, no mockery, and no judgment. She saw a raw, piercing recognition. "I can't," she whispered, her teeth chattering. "I need the money to pay him. To live." Silas stood up, pulling her to her feet with effortless strength. He kept one hand firmly wrapped around her upper arm, steadying her as she swayed in the freezing rain. He reached into a heavy leather pouch on his belt and pulled out a solid nugget of unrefined gold, roughly the size of a walnut. He tossed it carelessly into the mud at Beauregard's feet. It hit the slush with a heavy thwack. "That covers her debt," Silas announced to the silent watching street. "And it buys her peace from your pathetic little town." Beauregard stared at the gold, his greed warring with his wounded pride. "You're a fool, Boone," he spat, though he quickly stooped to snatch the gold from the mud. "You're throwing a fortune away on a ruined woman. She's not pure. She's damaged goods. She ain't a virgin, and she ain't a lady." Silas turned his head slowly. The look he gave Beauregard made the banker flinch. "Purity is an illusion, invented by weak men who are terrified of a woman with a past." Silas's voice boomed, echoing off the wooden storefronts, ensuring every gossip and coward in Bitter Creek heard him clearly. "You think a woman's worth is measured by who hasn't touched her? You think innocence makes a person strong?" Silas turned his gaze back to Josephine, his hand still warm and solid on her freezing arm. "I live at 10,000 feet, Silas continued, speaking only to her now. "The winters up there will snap a delicate flower in half before November is over. I don't want a pristine virgin who faints at the sight of blood or weeps when the fire goes out. I don't need fragile." He reached up, his rough, calloused thumb gently wiping a streak of mud from her pale cheek. "I watched you carry water in a blizzard last year when this town locked its doors on you," Silas murmured, the gravelly roughness of his voice softening just a fraction. "I watched you look a pack of vicious dogs in the eye and refuse to flinch. They spent 3 years trying to break you, Josephine Mercer, and they failed. I don't want the woman they wanted you to be. I want the woman they couldn't kill." Josephine's breath caught in her throat. The cold rain seemed to vanish, replaced by the overwhelming, solid heat radiating from the giant man standing before her. For 3 years, she had fought entirely alone. To have someone recognize that fight, to validate the armor she had been forced to build, struck a chord so deep inside her it felt like an earthquake. "I need a partner for my claim," Silas said, stepping back slightly, giving her space. The offer hung in the frigid air, massive and terrifying. "The cabin is warm. There is always meat in the smokehouse. I promise you hard work, isolation, and a silence you can hear. But I swear on my life, no man will ever lay an unwanted hand on you again. And you will never kneel in the mud for another soul." He gestured toward his packed mules. "I leave in 5 minutes. If you want to ride out of hell, get on the roan horse." Silas turned his back on her, a profound act of trust in a town full of enemies, and walked toward his animals. He didn't look back to see if she was following. Josephine stood frozen in the mud. She looked at Beauregard, who was frantically wiping the mud off the gold nugget. She looked at the ruined laundry at her feet. She looked at the town of Bitter Creek, the wooden prison that had tried to bury her alive. Then, she looked at the mountain man, checking the cinches on his pack saddles. Josephine didn't go back to her shack. She didn't pack her meager belongings. She wiped her muddy hands on her ruined skirt, lifted her chin, and walked straight toward the sturdy roan horse waiting at the edge of town. The journey out of Bitter Creek and up into the Black Ridge Mountains was a brutal, grueling trial that tested the absolute limits of Josephine's endurance. They rode out as the freezing rain transitioned into sleet, the ice pelting against them like tiny glass daggers. Silas rode point on a massive black draft cross, leading the string of pack mules, while Josephine followed on the roan. For the first few hours, neither spoke. The silence was profound, broken only by the rhythmic crunch of hooves on icy rocks and the howling of the wind through the towering pines. As they climbed higher in elevation, the temperature plummeted. The sleet turned into heavy, wet snow, rapidly accumulating on the narrow, treacherous switchback trails. Josephine was violently shivering. Her thin, threadbare shawl and soaked dress offered zero protection against the high-altitude freeze. Her fingers were numb, barely able to hold the reins, and her lips had turned a terrifying shade of blue. Silas stopped the train on a narrow ledge, overlooking a dizzying drop-off. He dismounted in one fluid motion and walked back to her horse. Without a word, he reached up and unbuckled the heavy, thick wolf fur coat he was wearing. I can't take your coat," Josephine chattered violently, her teeth clicking together so hard her jaw ached. "You'll freeze." "I'm used to the cold." "You are wearing a rag," Silas replied flatly. He didn't ask for permission. He reached up, pulled her off the saddle, and wrapped the enormous, heavy fur around her trembling shoulders. The coat smelled of wood smoke, pine needles, and the wild, masculine scent of the man himself. It was incredibly heavy, but the trapped heat radiating from the fur was immediate and intoxicating. He lifted her back into the saddle as if she weighed no more than a child's doll. "We have 5 more miles. It will get steeper. Do not look down." He turned back to his horse, clad only in his thick flannel shirt and leather vest, seemingly completely unbothered by the driving snow. The next 3 hours were a blur of agonizing physical exertion. The trail became so steep and narrow that riding became impossible. Silas signaled for her to dismount, and they led the animals on foot. The snow was knee-deep now, and every step required monumental effort. Josephine's legs screamed in protest, her lungs burning in the thin mountain air. She stumbled constantly, her frozen boots slipping on hidden ice. Twice, she fell hard into the snowdrifts. The first time, she instinctively waited for Silas to rush back and help her up, conditioned by the expectation of men either pitying her or mocking her weakness. Silas stopped. He looked back at her over his shoulder. He did not offer his hand. He just stood there, a monolithic statue in the blizzard, watching her with those dark, assessing eyes. "He wants to see if I'll break," Josephine realized, a sudden, fierce ember of anger flaring in her chest. "He wants to see if the town was right." Gritting her teeth, she pushed herself up on trembling arms, ignoring the agonizing ache in her knees. She grabbed the roan's reins, straightened her spine beneath the heavy fur coat, and took a step forward. Silas gave a single, barely perceptible nod, turned around, and continued climbing. That silent exchange forged an immediate, unspoken contract between them. He would not pamper her. He would not treat her like glass, but he would also not leave her behind. He demanded her strength, and in doing so, he reminded her that she still possessed it. By the time they crested the final ridge, night had completely fallen, and the blizzard was howling in full force. Through the swirling whiteout, a dark shape emerged against the stark white background. It was a large, solidly built, log cabin, nestled securely against a sheer rock face that protected it from the worst of the wind. Silas quickly stalled the animals in an attached, sturdy lean-to, ensuring they had hay and water before turning his attention to the cabin. He shoved the heavy oak door open, ushering Josephine inside out of the storm. The cabin was pitch black and freezing, but it was dry. Josephine stood shivering by the door, the heavy fur coat wrapped tightly around her, while Silas moved efficiently in the dark. Within minutes, the sharp tang of a struck match filled the air, followed by the warm, golden glow of an oil lantern. The space was rugged, but meticulously clean and organized. A massive stone fireplace dominated one wall. Cast iron pans hung neatly above a heavy wooden table. Shelves were lined with mason jars of preserved food, ammunition, and thick, worn books. A large bed piled high with thick woolen blankets and bear pelts sat in the far corner. Silas knelt by the hearth, rapidly building a fire with seasoned birch logs and dry pine needles. The fire caught with a satisfying roar, casting dancing shadows across the rough-hewn logs of the walls. "Sit!" Silas commanded, pointing to a heavy wooden rocking chair situated close to the hearth. Josephine moved numbly, sinking into the chair. The heat from the fire hit her like a physical blow, causing her frozen skin to tingle painfully as the blood rushed back to her extremities. She watched Silas as he moved about the cabin. He filled a kettle with water from an indoor hand pump and hung it over the fire. He pulled a heavy cast-iron Dutch oven from a shelf, scooped out some leftover stew, and set it on a bed of hot coals to warm. He was a man completely in his element, a master of this harsh, unforgiving domain. Once the chores were done, Silas dragged a sturdy wooden stool over to the fire and sat opposite her. He finally looked at her fully, the golden firelight softening the harsh edges of his scarred face. He noticed the dried blood on her hands, the raw, scraped skin on her knuckles from where she had frantically tried to save the laundry in the mud, and the deep, dark bags of exhaustion under her eyes. He stood up, walked to a wash basin, and poured warm water from the kettle into it. He grabbed a clean cloth, a bar of mild soap, and a small tin of salve. He carried them back to the fire and knelt on the floor in front of her chair. "Give me your hands," he said quietly. Josephine hesitated. For 3 years, every touch from a man had been a threat, a violation, or an act of violence. She instinctively pulled her hands deeper into the sleeves of his massive fur coat. Silas didn't force the issue. He simply waited, holding his hands open, palms up, huge, scarred, lethal hands that could snap a man's neck without effort. Hands that had killed bears and men alike. "I am not Beauregard Hayes," Silas said, his voice dropping to that low, earth-shaking rumble. "I am not your dead husband. I do not take what isn't offered, and I do not break what is already fragile." Josephine looked into his dark eyes. They were completely open, hiding nothing. She slowly pulled her hands out of the fur and laid them, trembling, into his massive palms. Silas's touch was unbelievably gentle. He used the warm, soapy cloth to carefully clean the dried mud and blood from her raw knuckles. He worked in total silence, his focus entirely on the task. The warmth of his hands and the water sent shivers down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold outside. After he dried her hands, he opened the small tin. The sharp scent of camphor and pine sap filled the air. He rubbed a generous amount of the thick salve into the cracks and cuts on her skin. "Why did you do it?" Josephine finally whispered, the silence of the cabin making her voice sound loud and fragile. "Why spend a fortune on a ruined woman you don't even know?" Silas finished bandaging a particularly bad scrape on her wrist before looking up. He didn't let go of her hands. "I told the town why," Silas answered plainly. "They think you're ruined because you survived a bad hand dealt to you by a worthless man. Up here, survival isn't a sin. It's the only requirement." He gently laid her hands back in her lap and stood up, towering over her. "You are safe here, Josephine. You sleep in the bed tonight. I will take the floor." "Silas," she said, saying his name aloud for the first time. It felt heavy and solid on her tongue. "I don't expect charity. I will work for my keep, but I won't. I am not your wife. I won't pretend to be." Silas walked over to the fire, using an iron poker to adjust the burning logs. The sparks flew up the chimney in a bright, swirling dance. "I didn't bring you up here to be a maid, and I didn't buy you to be a whore," Silas said, looking at the flames. "I told you I needed a partner. A mountain can drive a man insane if he listens to his own echo for too long. I needed someone who knows how to fight in the dark." He turned his head to look at her, the jagged scar on his face illuminated by the firelight. "We are both scarred, Josie. We just got them in different ways. Eat your stew. Rest. Tomorrow, we start building." Winter on Black Ridge Mountain did not merely arrive. It descended like a heavy iron cage, locking the world away beneath 8 feet of snow and ice. For the first month, Josephine braced herself for the inevitable moment when the isolation would drive Silas Boone to the cruelty she had come to expect from men. She waited for the demands, the raised voice, or the heavy hand when cabin fever set in. It never came. Instead, a strange, profound peace settled over the log cabin. Silas was a man of rigorous, unbroken routine. He chopped wood, checked his trap lines in the blinding whiteouts, and spent his evenings meticulously cleaning his rifles or working heavy leather into harnesses. He never once breached the invisible boundary he had drawn that first night. Josephine slept in the large, warm bed. Silas took the heavy pallet by the hearth. As the weeks bled into January of 1883, the bitter cold of the Wyoming Territory forced them into a silent, synchronized dance of survival. Josephine refused to be a burden. She took over the processing of the meat Silas brought home, learning to salt-cure venison and render bear fat. She mended his heavy buckskins, her fingers growing strong and calloused, no longer the raw, bleeding appendages of a town outcast. One frigid afternoon, while the wind screamed around the eaves of the cabin, Silas placed his heavy Winchester 1873 rifle on the rough-hewn table. He slid a box of brass cartridges next to it. "The mountain does not care if you are a man or a woman," Silas rumbled, pulling up a stool. "It only cares if you are prepared. If I break my leg in a deadfall miles from here, or if a hungry cougar comes through that window, crying won't save you. You need to know how to kill." Josephine stared at the blued steel of the weapon. Jeremiah, her late husband, had explicitly forbidden her from touching firearms, claiming they were unladylike and dangerous in a woman's hands. Beauregard Hayes had relied on her being unarmed to terrorize her. Slowly, she reached out and wrapped her hands around the cold, heavy stock. Silas spent the next 3 weeks teaching her. He showed her how to break the weapon down, how to oil the firing pin, and how to pack her own powder. When the blizzards finally broke, leaving a blindingly bright, cloudless sky over the snow-choked valley, he took her out to the tree line. "Breathe out," Silas instructed, his massive presence standing just behind her shoulder, close enough to provide warmth but not touching her. "Don't yank the trigger. Squeeze it like you're holding a fragile bird. Let the shot surprise you." Josephine sighted down the barrel at a tin coffee pot hanging from a dead pine branch 50 yards away. She remembered the smirks of the men in Bitter Creek. She remembered Henrietta Higgins spitting at her feet. She exhaled, letting the icy air leave her lungs, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle roared, kicking hard against her shoulder. 50 yards away, the tin pot spun violently off the branch. A clean hole punched dead center. Silas did not smile, but his dark eyes gleamed with a deep, quiet pride. "Good. Now reload. Faster this time." By late February, they were no longer strangers sharing a roof. They were partners. The silences between them were no longer filled with tension, but with a comfortable, unspoken understanding. Silas began to talk, his voice a low, gravelly hum in the quiet evenings. He told her about his past before the mountain, how he had scouted for General Crook out of Fort Fetterman during the harsh campaigns, and how the endless, senseless slaughter of the plains had driven him to seek a place where the only blood spilled was for survival, not politics. He told her about the grizzly bear that gave him his scar, a terrifying encounter near the Yellowstone Basin that cost him his left eye's peripheral vision and nearly his life. In turn, Josephine spoke of the suffocating, gilded cage of her youth back east, and the manipulative charm of Jeremiah Mercer that had lured her into hell. Silas listened without interruption, without offering empty platitudes. He simply sharpened his hunting knife, validating her pain by treating it as a battle scar rather than a mark of shame. But 50 miles below them, the civilized world was refusing to let them go. In the smoky, opulent back room of the Bitter Creek Saloon, Beauregard Hayes was nursing a bruised ego that had festered into an obsession. The town gossips had not stopped whispering about how the massive mountain man had publicly humiliated him, buying the ruined widow right out from under his polished boots. Hayes was losing face, and in a frontier town, losing face meant losing power. He poured a glass of expensive Kentucky bourbon and pushed it across the felt-lined poker table to a man whose very presence made the air in the room feel foul. Gideon Galt was a discharged tracker from the 9th Cavalry at Fort D. A. Russell, a man who had been court-martialed for excessive cruelty. He was lean, wiry, and completely devoid of a moral compass, sporting a silver front tooth and a pair of customized Colt revolvers tied low on his thighs. He made his living hunting down bounties and doing the dark, bloody work that wealthy men like Hayes preferred to keep off their ledgers. "I don't care about the mountain man," Hayes said, his voice slick with venom. "Kill him. Leave him for the wolves. But the woman comes back alive. I want her dragged through the main street of Bitter Creek, tied to the back of a horse. I want every soul in this territory to see what happens when you spit in my face." Galt tipped the bourbon back, his dark eyes glittering with malicious amusement. "Boone's a hard man to kill, Hayes. He knows that high country better than the native tribes do. It'll cost you double. $500. Gold. Not your worthless bank paper." "Done," Hayes snapped, tossing a heavy leather pouch onto the table. "Just bring her to me. Break her if you have to, but bring her back." The first sign of trouble came on a deceptively calm morning in early March. The brutal freeze had begun to break, the snowpack turning slick and treacherous under the warming afternoon sun. Josephine was outside, kneeling by a frozen stream 100 yards from the cabin, using an iron pick to break the ice to haul water. The air was crisp and still, the only sound the rhythmic thwack of iron against ice. Suddenly, Silas's two massive livestock dogs, a pair of ferocious mastiff crosses that usually slept lazily by the woodpile, erupted into a cacophony of vicious, frantic barking. Josephine stood up, her hand instinctively dropping to the heavy Colt revolver Silas insisted she wear whenever she left the cabin. Silas burst from the cabin door, his Winchester already leveled at his shoulder, his eyes scanning the dense timberline below. "Josie, move!" he roared, a tone she had never heard him use before, frantic, urgent, lethal. A sharp, distinct crack echoed off the canyon walls. A rifle bullet smashed into the ice just inches from Josephine's boot, sending a spray of frozen shards into her face. She didn't scream. The weeks of rigorous training kicked in. She dropped her water buckets, put her head down, and sprinted for the cabin in a zigzag pattern, her heavy boots churning the slush. 2 more shots rang out, ripping through the heavy canvas of her coat, missing her flesh by a fraction of an inch. Silas provided covering fire, the Winchester barking a rapid, deafening rhythm. He laid down a wall of lead into the brush where the shots had originated, forcing the unseen attackers to keep their heads down. Josephine hit the heavy oak door and tumbled inside, Silas right behind her. He slammed the door shut and threw the massive iron drawbar into place. "Get down," Silas commanded, immediately moving to a reinforced loophole he had built into the cabin's thick logs. The silence outside was heavy and expectant. Then, a voice drifted up from the tree line, a mocking, nasal drawl that cut through the crisp mountain air. "Silas Boone, I got 5 men out here with plenty of ammunition and nowhere to be," Gideon Galt yelled, safely hidden behind a massive boulder. "Hayes wants the girl. Send the soiled dove out, and we'll leave you to your furs. Fight us, and we burn this log box to the ground with both of you in it." Josephine knelt behind the heavy oak table, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She looked at Silas. The mountain man's face was an emotionless mask of stone. "They won't leave you alive, regardless of what they say," Silas stated plainly, smoothly reloading his rifle. "Galt is a snake. He kills for the pleasure of it." "How many?" Josephine asked, her voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding her veins. 5. 6, including Galt. They are positioned in a semicircle. They have us pinned. Silas looked back at her, his dark eyes locking onto hers. "Are you afraid, Josephine?" "Yes," she answered honestly. She checked the cylinder of her Colt, ensuring all 6 chambers were loaded. "But I am not going back to Bitter Creek." A sudden barrage of gunfire erupted from the trees. Bullets chewed into the thick logs of the cabin, sending splinters flying through the dim interior. A heavy slug shattered one of the small, thick glass windows, raining glass across the floor. Silas returned fire with deadly precision. He didn't waste lead. Every time a tracker broke cover to reposition, Silas fired once. A scream of agony echoed from the brush as one of Galt's men took a Winchester round through the thigh. But there were too many of them. The trackers laid down a suppressive barrage, keeping Silas pinned away from the loophole. "They're moving up the left flank," Silas shouted over the deafening roar of gunfire. "They're trying to reach the blind spot by the chimney." Before Silas could shift his position, a deafening explosion shattered the wooden door of the cabin. Galt's men had managed to throw a stick of dynamite at the porch. The door held, but the concussion was massive. The shock wave threw Silas backward, slamming his head brutally against the stone hearth. He crumpled to the floor, stunned and bleeding profusely from a gash on his forehead. The gunfire outside paused. They knew the dynamite had done damage. "Boone's down!" a voice yelled from just outside the shattered window. Heavy boots crunched on the snow on the porch. Josephine didn't think. The paralyzing terror that had defined her life in Bitter Creek was gone, burned away by the raw, unyielding fire of the mountain. She grabbed Silas's dropped Winchester from the floor. A tracker kicked the damaged oak door, trying to force it off its broken hinges. The heavy iron drawbar groaned but held. A face appeared in the shattered window, a grinning, filthy man raising a shotgun. Josephine stepped into the light. She didn't flinch. She raised the heavy rifle, exhaled exactly as Silas had taught her, and pulled the trigger. The rifle roared. The man in the window vanished, thrown backward off the porch into the snow by the impact of the heavy 44-40 caliber bullet. "One down!" Josephine screamed, her voice cracking with a fierce, feral rage. She racked the lever of the Winchester, ejecting the smoking brass casing, and aimed the weapon directly at the heavy wooden door. "Come on, you cowards," she roared over the whistling wind. "You want me? Come and get me!" Outside, Gideon Galt hesitated. The reports from town had painted Josephine Mercer as a broken, weeping widow. The woman currently raining hellfire from the cabin sounded like a cornered wolverine. On the floor, Silas groaned, his vision blurring as he tried to push himself up. He looked through the smoke and dust filling the cabin and saw Josephine standing tall amidst the ruin, the rifle firmly at her shoulder, her gray eyes blazing with absolute, undeniable fury. She wasn't the fragile woman he had pulled from the mud. She was the storm itself. And God help any man foolish enough to stand in her way. The heavy 44-40 caliber rifle bucked against Josephine's shoulder again, spitting fire and smoke into the freezing mountain air. The remaining 4 men outside scrambled for the safety of the tree line, their previous bravado entirely shattered. They had come expecting to slaughter a sleeping mountain man and drag a weeping, broken woman back to town. Instead, they had walked into a fortress defended by a woman who shot with the cold, mechanical precision of an executioner. Behind her, Silas pulled himself up, using the edge of the heavy oak table. Blood poured from the deep laceration above his eye, matting into his thick beard. But the concussion had not robbed him of his lethal instincts. He watched Josephine smoothly lever another round into the chamber, her jaw set, her gray eyes devoid of panic. He didn't take the rifle from her. He drew his heavy Colt single-action revolver and moved to the shattered window to cover her blind spot. "They're flanking right. Toward the lean-to!" Josephine shouted over her shoulder, recognizing the shifting shadows against the snow glare. "They're going to try and burn out the horses." "Not today," Silas rumbled. He kicked the shattered remnants of the front window frame out of the way, leaned his massive upper body into the biting wind, and fanned the hammer of his Colt. 3 rapid, deafening shots tore through the heavy brush. A man shrieked, dropping a kerosene lantern that instantly ignited the snowbank into a blazing, hissing wall of orange flame. Suddenly, a heavy thud echoed from the rear of the cabin. Gideon Galt had abandoned his men at the front. The disgraced tracker, a man who famously bragged he had outrun the legendary real-life Pinkerton detective Charlie Siringo across 3 territories, knew a losing battle when he saw one, but he also knew Beauregard Hayes would kill him if he returned empty-handed. Galt had scaled the sheer rock face at the back of the cabin and was currently prying his way through the heavy wooden shutters of the root cellar access. "Back wall," Silas roared, spinning around. But his boots slipped on the blood pooling on the floorboards from his head wound. He went down hard on one knee. The cellar door splintered inward with a violent crash. Galt burst up from the floorboards, covered in dirt and frost, a wicked, jagged Bowie knife gripped tightly in his hand. His silver front tooth flashed in the dim, smoky light of the cabin as he lunged directly at Josephine. He moved with the terrifying speed of a striking rattlesnake. Before Josephine could swing the long barrel of the Winchester around in the confined space, Galt batted the rifle aside with his left forearm and slammed his right hand around her throat, driving her brutally against the stone hearth. "You're coming with me, you little Bitter Creek Y." Galt never finished his sentence. Josephine didn't scream. She didn't faint. The days of freezing in the mud and taking the abuse of cruel men were over. She dropped the useless rifle, reached down to her hip, and drew the heavy hunting knife Silas had given her to process meat. With a guttural cry fueled by 3 years of repressed, boiling rage, she drove the 6-inch steel blade deep into the meaty part of Galt's shoulder, twisting it savagely. Galt screamed, a high-pitched, reedy sound of absolute shock, his grip on her throat instantly releasing. He stumbled backward, staring in horror at the handle protruding from his shoulder. Before Galt could draw his own weapon, a shadow eclipsed the lantern light. Silas Boone rose from the floor like an awakened grizzly. He grabbed Galt by the collar of his heavy wool coat, lifted the wiry tracker completely off his feet, and slammed him face first into the thick, load-bearing timber of the cabin wall. The sickening crack of bone ended the fight instantly. Galt crumpled to the floor, unconscious and bleeding out. Outside, the remaining 3 men, seeing the flames from the dropped lantern and hearing the sudden, terrifying silence from inside the cabin, broke. They scrambled to their horses, cut their losses, and spurred their mounts recklessly down the treacherous, icy switchbacks toward the safety of the valley. The siege was over. The cabin was dead silent, save for the crackle of the fire and the howling wind pouring through the shattered door. Josephine stood by the hearth, gasping for air, her hands trembling violently as the adrenaline began to recede. She looked down at the blood on her hands, not her own blood, not the blood of innocent laundry, but the blood of a man who had tried to drag her back to hell. Silas turned to her. He was breathing heavily, his face a mask of blood and soot. He crossed the room in 2 massive strides and pulled her against his chest. It was the first time he had truly embraced her. He didn't hold her like a fragile glass doll. He held her like a fellow warrior who had just held the line. "You're alive," Silas breathed into her dark, tangled hair. "You held them." Josephine wrapped her arms around his waist, burying her face in the heavy, smoky fur of his coat. "They won't stop, Silas," she whispered fiercely. "Hayes will just send more. He will burn this mountain to the ground just to see me broken." Silas pulled back, looking down into her eyes. The firelight reflected off the cold, hard certainty in his gaze. "No," Silas said softly. "A predator only hunts when he thinks the prey is running. It's time we showed Beauregard Hayes that he is no longer at the top of the food chain." 2 days later, the town of Bitter Creek was going about its miserable, mud-soaked business when the warning cry rang out from the watchtower above the silver mine. Down the main street rode a procession that brought every merchant, miner, and gossip to a dead halt. Silas Boone rode point on his massive black horse, his face heavily bandaged, his heavy Winchester resting casually across his saddle horn. Trailing behind him on a long lead rope were 2 horses, bearing the groaning, battered bodies of Gideon Galt and the other surviving tracker, tied securely to their saddles. But it was the rider next to Silas that caused Henrietta Higgins to drop her basket of apples into the dirt. Josephine Mercer did not return to Bitter Creek in a threadbare shawl, eyes cast down in shame. She rode a tall roan gelding, sitting tall in the saddle. She wore a heavy leather coat tailored to her frame, a wide-brimmed Stetson pulled low over her piercing gray eyes, and a gleaming Colt revolver strapped unapologetically to her thigh. She looked wild, lethal, and utterly untouchable. They rode straight to the center of town, stopping directly in front of the Bitter Creek Saloon. Beauregard Hayes stepped out onto the boardwalk, flanked by his usual enforcers. The smug, arrogant sneer melted from his face the moment he saw the bloody, defeated bounty hunters and the cold steel in Silas Boone's eyes. "What is the meaning of this, Boone?" Hayes demanded, his voice cracking, betraying his sudden, deep-seated terror. "You ride into my town and disrupt the peace? Your men trespassed on my claim, Hayes," Silas's voice boomed, carrying easily over the dead silent street. "They tried to murder my partner. Under territorial law, I have the right to hang them from the nearest pine. But I brought them back to you." Silas drew his knife and cut the lead rope, tossing it into the mud at Hayes's feet, a deliberate echo of the gold nugget he had thrown down months ago. "I don't know what you're talking about." Hayes lied frantically, taking a step back as his enforcers nervously eyed Silas's rifle. "I didn't hire these men. They have the Pinkerton bounties in their pockets, Beauregard. A new, sharp voice cut through the tension. From the porch of the assayer's office across the street stepped a tall, meticulously dressed man wearing a silver star. It was Deputy U.S. Marshal Bass Reeves, who had arrived in town just the night before. Silas, anticipating Hayes's eventual retaliation, had used a passing fur trapper weeks ago to send a wired message to Fort Smith, detailing Hayes's illegal land grabs, embezzlement, and the hiring of wanted outlaws. Mr. Boone's wire tipped us off. Hayes, the marshal said, stepping down into the street, a shotgun cradled in his arm. We've been auditing your bank's ledgers since dawn. You've been stealing from the territorial government, foreclosing on widows illegally, and harboring known fugitives like Gideon Galt here. Hayes turned pale, looking wildly around for an escape route. But the townspeople who had feared him for years were suddenly blocking the alleys, their faces hard. They respected power, and the power in Bitter Creek had just violently shifted hands. Josie, Hayes pleaded, turning a pathetic, desperate gaze toward the woman he had tried to destroy. Tell them I was just trying to help you. Josephine walked her horse forward, closing the distance until she was looking down at the man who had made her life a living hell. She didn't draw her gun. She didn't need to. The absolute contempt in her eyes was a far more devastating weapon. My name is Josephine Boone, she said, her voice ringing clear and steady as a church bell, sealing her partnership and her future. And you are nothing but dirt on my boots. She turned her horse seamlessly, leaving Hayes to the marshal's irons, and rode back to Silas's side. They didn't linger. They didn't wait for the town's apologies or their sudden, hypocritical admiration. They turned their horses toward the high timberline, riding away from the mud and the whispers, ascending back into the brutal, beautiful silence of the mountain that had forged them into something unbreakable. The frontier was a brutal place that broke the weak and shattered the delicate. But as Josephine and Silas proved, sometimes the deepest love isn't found in a pristine parlor. It's forged in the absolute fires of survival. He didn't want an untouched, fragile flower. He wanted the woman who could stare down the darkest wolves and refuse to flinch. Their story is a powerful reminder that our scars don't make us ruined. They make us dangerously unbreakable. If you were captivated by this intense, gritty tale of Wild West, revenge, survival, and a romance that defies all the rules, hit that like button right now. We bring you the most thrilling, dramatic storytelling on the internet. Share this video with someone who loves a strong, unstoppable heroine. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and ring the bell so you never miss another epic frontier drama.
Hi, my name is Phạm Thanh, the owner and manager of Mountain Hearts. After watching the video, Mountain Man said he didn't want a virgin. He just wanted the woman everyone else tried to break. I really like to know what you think. How did this story make you feel? What stayed with me most was how deeply the story focused on acceptance instead of perfection. The mountain man didn't care about appearances or someone's past. He cared about the strength it took to survive. That made the connection between them feel honest and grounded in something real. I think the story quietly reminds us how powerful it can be when someone sees value in us after the world has tried to tear us down. Have you ever had someone believe in you when you struggle to believe in yourself? And which moment made you feel their relationship truly changed? If this story meant something to you, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy emotional mountain stories about healing, loyalty, and unexpected love, you can like or subscribe to support the channel.
Hi, my name is Robert Bowen, the owner and manager of Rugged Heart Man. After watching the video, Mountain Man said he didn't want a virgin, he just wanted the woman everyone else tried to break. I'd really like to know what you think. How did this story make you feel? What stood out to me most was the sense of acceptance running through the story. Instead of focusing on appearances or expectations, it highlighted the value of seeing a person for who they truly are. There was something touching about watching a connection grow from understanding rather than judgment. One gentle reminder from this story is that everyone carries experiences others may never fully understand. Sometimes the people who have been through the hardest seasons are also the ones with the most strength and heart. Do you think the mountain man saw her differently than everyone else did? Was there a moment in the story that stayed with you after it ended? In our own lives, we can try to look beyond first impressions and offer a little more grace to the people around us. If this story meant something to you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy stories like this, feel free to like and subscribe for more from Rugged Heart Man.